Hello, hello, hello. We're Q the Light from Clinton Community Television. I'm Rachel.
I'm Jenny.
I'm Misha.
And today we're here with Dr. Vera Goodkin, whom I had the pleasure of meeting 6 years ago when I interviewed her for 5th grade about the Holocaust and her amazing account of escaping it from her home country in Prague in the Czech Republic.
Would you like me to start at the beginning?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. First of all, I was born in Czechoslovakia, and I lived, this is for your benefit, I was born in Hradec Králové.
Really? I have relatives that live there, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. It was a wonderful, wonderful life. It just didn't last long enough. When I was about 3 years old, my parents were receiving guests, overnight guests. Some would stay 2 days, some would stay as long as 2 weeks. And I was too young to even ask a question. I knew that they weren't friends or relatives, but there they were. And when they left, they were replaced by others. When I was 5, and this was going on all this time, my maternal grandmother, whom I absolutely adored, and who unfortunately perished in Auschwitz, was visiting, and she said to my mother, and I was 5 and I understood a lot more, and she said to my mother, you know, these German Jews who enjoy your hospitality must know something that you don't. Why don't you and your little family find a safer place to be until this insanity blows over? And the only time I ever heard my mother raise her voice to her mother, she said, how can you say a thing like that? This is a perfect democracy. This is our utopia. Nothing is ever going to happen here. Well, unfortunately, my mother regretted those words for the rest of her life, because on March 15th, 1939, the Nazis moved into Czechoslovakia, and life changed completely. It changed so drastically. Every time the Nazis occupied a territory or a nation, the Nuremberg laws came into effect. And there were essentially 3 major components. One was the most important. As soon as they occupied part of a country or a territory, the Jewish citizens of that country lost their citizenship rights, their civil rights, and their human rights. And that means that you could be walking down the middle of the street in the middle of the day, and somebody could put a bullet in the middle of your forehead. And as you crumpled to the ground, they could walk away with impunity, because we didn't exist. We had lost the protection of the law. Second, and this happened within a very short period of time, within weeks, all of a sudden, we could not get an education. It started out at the top. Jewish students could no longer attend universities, colleges, high schools, elementary schools, public schools of any kind. And then it became an offense punishable by anything from a fine to a sentence of death to homeschool your kids. And the third very, very important component was that all of a sudden we were not permitted to practice professions. I mentioned that my father was a physician. 6 weeks after the occupation, he could no longer practice medicine. But along with all the educated men, all the lawyers, all the engineers and teachers and pharmacists and generally the educated population, were put on labor brigades. His particular assignment was to fill wheelbarrows with enormous rocks and then ferry those rocks across a very narrow plank that connected two hilltops. It was truly a dangerous occupation, particularly for people who had never done this kind of physical labor. There were no breaks, there were no wages. There was just humiliation and abuse. And then there were the minor annoyances, like not being able to gather in groups larger than 3, not being able to leave your home after the sun went down and before dawn, not being able to go to a theater or a park or any enjoyable public place. And of course, we all wore what they called the badge of shame. The badge of shame was a yellow star of David, 6 inches in diameter, which had to be securely sewn or affixed to our outer clothing. We had to put it on the strollers of toddlers and the carriages of babies. So those of us who didn't look Jewish could be identified for harassment. You know, not everyone looked Jewish. I still have blue eyes and I'm fair-skinned, but at that time I had a head full of golden ringlets. And that certainly was more Aryan than many of the Aryans who lived there. And so people like myself had to be identified. But the icing on our cake came a few weeks after that, when there was a knock at our door. And when my mother opened the door, the people standing outside said, "You don't live here anymore, we do." And we were given a half hour to pack whatever we thought would be useful in one suitcase for each hand, not too heavy so we could carry them. And we were homeless. And at that point, we realized that we had to do something, because otherwise we were going to lose our lives as well. So we became what I have been referring to as professional escapees. We started out hiding out in places that were owned by people who knew us, people who were friends or people who were humanitarians and who said, "Well, here's a key to my little cottage in the little village in the woods." And essentially we kept running from place to place to place for the next, from the fall of 1939 to the spring of 1943, at which time we were betrayed and captured. During that time, perhaps the most difficult part of it was uncertainty. And it got ratcheted up to the point where I didn't really care what happened. I just wanted it to happen right away. But I was still with my parents, and we were going from place to place. As we went on and the war went on, there was less food. But the fear, the uncertainty perhaps was the hardest. In those years, we spent more time in cottages behind false walls. People would build a wall and we would be behind that wall where no one would know that there was a space there. In attics and cellars. In odd places where we could hide. If you undoubtedly know, Czechoslovakia was made up of 3 entities, Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia. And we started out in Bohemia. My hometown was in Bohemia. And we crossed into Moravia and ended up in Slovakia, very close to the Hungarian border. And we were in an attic at that time, and I guess we cast the shadow that someone saw. And we were visited by what they called the Jewish property confiscation team, which would have been really funny if it hadn't been so sad. We had nothing left to confiscate. But a committee of 4, a member of the SS, a member of the local secret police, the local collaborator, probably the person who gave us away, and they brought along a young Jewish attorney who had to draw up legal papers for the confiscation. Well, it was actually a useful visit because we knew that as soon as this happened, we would be in the first transport to Auschwitz. And so my mother, who was not one to give up, decided that she needed to do something. And she had heard that there was a group of farmers whose farms were in Slovakia, but part of their property was over in Hungary, over the border. So it spanned 2 countries, and some of them volunteered to guide potential victims across from Slovakia to Hungary. It was an organization, I guess, akin to the Underground Railroad for slaves. My mother went from house to house trying to find a contact. She had a lot of doors slammed in her face because people were afraid to talk. But ultimately, she made contact, and we were told to, first of all, take off our badge of shame, make sure that there are no telltale threads on our clothing, and go to the local train station and take a local train to a little village. If we were lucky enough not to be asked for IDs, because the police would get on public transportation and go through and ask everyone for IDs, we would have been lost. But if we were lucky enough to get off in that village, and when the train pulled out of the station, we would see a young man at the end of the platform. When he started walking, we were to follow him to his home. We followed him at a reasonable distance, and it was about 11 o'clock at night, pitch dark, and we ended up on the edge of a forest, and he had a very poor little farm, one large room, which housed 3 generations of his family and some small farm animals. The young farmer took a very tall ladder, propped it up against the attic window, and motioned to us to go up there. And as we were climbing, he whispered, "Please be very quiet, because my mother-in-law is visiting, and she's a Nazi sympathizer, so if she knew you were here, you wouldn't be here very long." But we took that to heart. We were very quiet, and then we heard odd noises. The odd noises proved that we were not really alone, because the rat population of the farm decided to live in the attic. And I was 12, and I remember how frightened I was. Excuse me. because my father didn't have much hair, and I was afraid that when he lay down on the ground, those creatures would get at his head. So I had a little scarf, and I took it off and put it around his head. Oh. And I felt really brave. So we spent about 24 hours up there being as quiet as we could, and we heard the rain coming down. But we didn't know what it was going to mean to us, or to our transit. So the next night, we heard the ladder come up against the window, and that was our signal to go down and start walking across the border. First of all, by the time we got to the bottom of the ladder, we were soaked to the skin. And then we realized that that rich soil in the forest was full of water, and we would sink down into it to mid-calf and literally had to lift each foot out of the mud, shake off the excess, and then keep on going. So that was labor intensive enough, and we weren't paying much attention to anything else. But our guide, of course, was very vigilant, and he saw a flicker of light at a distance that he wasn't accustomed to seeing before. And all he could think of was that there was a changing of the guard, and the new guard mapped out a new patrol route, and they might well run into us. And that's something he didn't want. So he, without saying a word, he turned on his heels and started walking away from us, leaving us in the middle of the night in a pouring rain in the pitch black forest. I was actually relieved. And I said to my mother, you know, I'm just going to lean against this tree back here. And my logic, of course, was that if I took a little nap when I woke up, I would realize that this was all just a nightmare. And then if I woke up and it was my reality, I wasn't interested in waking up. But my mother was not impressed. And instead, she was screaming and running after the man in the forest, yelling, "You have children of your own. Are you going to let this one die?" Well, considering that he was already risking his life, he was a very nice man. And he stopped and motioned to us to follow him back to the cottage. Excuse me, which we did, and spent 2 more days being very quiet. He would sneak us some food every so often. And on the 3rd night, we successfully crossed the border. The mud had dried out, and we made it. And of course, we had to take a train in Hungary to reach Budapest. And that was the only city left in all of Central Europe that still had a Jewish population. 450,000 Hungarian Jews had already been deported to Auschwitz. And among them, of course, my very smart grandmother and many, many of my relatives. So we came into Budapest. Why were the Jews of Budapest still, excuse me, the allergy is getting to me. Anyway, there were so many Jews who tried to save themselves because survival was measured not in months or in weeks or even in days. Sometimes it was measured in minutes. So if you gain time, maybe there was a chance that you would survive the nightmare. And so all people who knew about this possibility tried to get to Budapest. And this happened only because Adolf Eichmann had settled in Budapest with his cronies because it was a nice place to have a good time. Berlin was already pretty badly scarred by the war, and they were losing the war. So he moved his headquarters over to Budapest, and somebody told him that if he left the Jews sort of scattered throughout the city of Budapest, the Allies wouldn't bomb his headquarters. So that gained us 2 months. 2 months was a lifetime. But after 2 months, he realized that somebody was just fooling him. And he began with new energy and anger. He began finishing his, it's okay. Thank you. Might help. He set about to finish his final solution with the Hungarian Jews. And he started out by taking the resident Jews, the indigenous Jews, families that had been in Hungary for 1,000 years, putting them into ghettos. There was an area of about 5 square blocks. Within 2 weeks of his renewed activity, there were 70,000 people in there. So you can imagine how they lived. We were labeled alien Jews, and the alien Jews were taken immediately to holding prisons for the death camps. So that night, we were awakened. The Nazis did a lot of their things at night because people were disoriented, and it was easier to drive them anywhere you wanted. And we were being driven at night to the outskirts of Budapest, where there is still, if any of you visit Budapest, it's an interesting place to visit. It's a medieval fortress called Polonc, T-O-L-O-N-C, and a real fortress. I mean, it had a moat, it had a drawbridge, it had very tall stone walls, and when the gates opened and we crossed the bridge, we got into a yard where people were stuffed like sardines. We could take a few steps in, and we couldn't go any further. So that night we spent trying to sleep standing up. If you're tired enough, that can be done. And the next morning, they took 2,000 people out of the dungeons, another very practical feature of for destruction. And those people, those 2,000, were taken in a transport to Auschwitz, and they made room for us in the dungeons. The first thing I noticed, well, first of all, it was certainly no improvement, because after all those years, we were miserable, but we were together. And at this point, the men were driven in one direction, the women and children in the other direction, and we lost contact with my father. So we found ourselves with other mothers and children and women who had no children. In other words, women and children in this particular dungeon. First thing that occurred to me was that there was nothing there. There wasn't a piece of furniture. There wasn't a blanket, not a chair, nothing, not a cot. And then as my eyes got accustomed to the grayness, I saw that there were polka dots on the wall. And then as I focused in, the polka dots were moving. The polka dots were well-nourished bed bugs. And I don't think I need to explain who was their food supply for the next month or so. And so by the time we were transported to the next holding prison, closer to the Austrian border, most of us were suffering from diseases of filth and malnutrition. In this second formerly military facility, my mother was in the tailor shop making uniforms for the SS, and I and the other children tried to survive as best we could, until one day all the mothers and their children were called to the courtyard, where the commander of the prison introduced us to 3 men. And he said these men had come as inspectors from the Swedish Red Cross, and they convinced him that this was no place to keep children. And so he was going to permit all children above the age of 5 and below the age of 14 to join these men and leave the prison, provided their mothers let them go. Well, I think you probably can guess that most mothers wouldn't do it. And that's what he counted on. But my mother was unusually wise and very courageous. And so she very gently pushed me into the arms of one of those men. And when we were reunited, she told me what went through her mind was that if that night I was going to sleep in a bed and eat something you could call food and survive to tell the story, then she had no right to hold on to me. But it was such a momentous decision that she passed out. And I turned around, I wanted to help her. 2 of the men bodily picked me up and carried me outside the walls of the prison, where they had a whole fleet of cars and trucks, in the hopes that they would pick up, they went from prison to prison, that they would pick up more and more children. And they said to me, we are really not members of the Swedish Red Cross, but we are friends of a Swedish hero, Raoul Wallenberg. And he asked us to do this because he would like to save as many innocent victims as possible, particularly children, because children are humanity's hope for a better future. With this, they took me to a children's home where I met and befriended 26 other kids between the ages of 5 and 14, whose mothers had the same courage and determination my mother did. I didn't stay there very long because there was a scarlet fever epidemic, and I became very ill. And so I was taken to a hospital for contagious diseases. While I was there, and I didn't know about this, the Hungarian equivalent of the SS, they called themselves the Arrow Cross. They had, their logo was a cross, a horizontal cross, and a vertical cross. And they were the Arrow Cross. They were not nearly as disciplined as the SS. Why could Wallenberg get away with some of the things he got away with? Because Hitler had this mania about the Aryan race. And who is more Aryan than the Scandinavians? And so the Swedes were not part of the armed conflict. They were neutral. So he did not want to antagonize them, and therefore it was known to the SS that any building that flew the Swedish flag was off limits, except the Aerocross bums couldn't care less. And so on a drunken Sunday afternoon, they broke into this home that flew the Swedish flag and killed 26 kids. I didn't know about this. When I was discharged from the hospital, I was taken to an orphanage. And I thought that was a very appropriate placement because I was truly convinced that I was an orphan. What I didn't know was that what started out as a tragedy ended up as another miracle. And that was my mother was actually in one of the cattle wagons en route to Auschwitz. And the train had been chugging along for 2 days. And all of a sudden, it changed direction and entered the very last holding prison on Hungarian soil, because it had one passenger who wasn't supposed to be there. And that passenger was the daughter-in-law of the regent, the Hungarian ruler of the country, even though the Germans, Hungary collaborated, so they were not occupied. They had their own head of state. The son of their head of state, their regent, Admiral Horthy, married a Jewish girl. He couldn't keep her out of prison, but he made the Hungarian authorities promise that they would not deport her to a death camp. And somebody, either accidentally or on purpose, put her in that transport, and now there were no passenger lists. They had to find a needle in a haystack. So they opened all the wagons and were trying to find this young woman. As my mother tumbled out of the wagon, she saw somebody who looked like my father. And it turned out that he had been serving as prisoner physician in that last camp. And when he saw her, he disappeared for a while, came back, and as he brushed by her, he put a little glass vial in her hand and whispered, "Take this." She did, and she lost consciousness, which is exactly what he wanted. He wanted her out of harm's way, perhaps in the infirmary, and saving her life. The guard ran after the stretcher and yelled, "I have to deliver 2,000 bodies, and I don't care if they're alive or dead." But just at that time, he got orders from the German command. They were waiting on the border for this transport that wasn't coming. And they found out why, and they were very angry. And the order was, don't bring them anymore. Just line them up on the periphery, on the outside of the prison wall, and machine gun them. There were 4 survivors out of that transport. My mother, the young lady they found, and 2 unbelievably resourceful prisoners who must have found a place to hide. Well, that was a miracle I didn't know about. But what happened was, after he saved her life, my father did not see my mother again for 3 months because he was in the men's camp. He was just crossing on some errand when they came in. But by that time, the war was going very badly for the Nazis, and the partisans, the freedom fighters in the vicinity of the prison, were playing games, and one of the games they played was to disable some of the gates to the prison. which enabled some able-bodied prisoners to try to escape. Most of them were recaptured within hours. For whatever reason, somebody up there was looking. My parents were not captured and ran into each other. And they were, for the next 3 weeks, they walked in war-torn territory, sleeping in ditches and bombed-out farmhouses, foraging for food. And in 3 weeks, on foot, they made it back to Budapest. And by the time they got there, Wallenberg had a reputation. And so they heard about this unbelievable hero who was giving out protective passes to anybody that he could find and housing them in one of 33 high-rise apartment houses that he had purchased or rented with money that was given to him by his king, as well as by the United States War Refugee Board. These houses flew the Swedish flag. And so when my parents hit Budapest, and Budapest was already being conquered by the Russians were approaching Budapest. Parts of it were already belonged to the Russians. Parts of it still belonged to the Nazis. When they heard about this hero, they decided they would try to reach the Swedish embassy. When they did, they were very, very lucky. For one thing, Wallenberg was in his office. And in about 5 minutes, my parents were in shock because in their hand they had one of those precious passes and permission to be taken to one of the protected houses that flew the Swedish flag. And then Wallenberg said to my father, "And you know, we still have your little girl." And I was brought from the orphanage, and I thought I was seeing things. I hung on to my parents for dear life because I thought if I let them go, they would disappear. And we spent the last 10 days of the Battle of Budapest, at least in our part of Budapest, in the cellar of one of those protected houses. And on January 16th, 1945, the sewer covers lifted and out came the Russian army. And the war was over for us. That night, a magical night, the Russians sat and played the balalaika all night long and gave us chocolate. And 2 days later, in a hail of bullets and in a snowstorm, we began walking away from that place to a safer spot. And 2 weeks later, we found ourselves on the way to Czechoslovakia and the life we had left behind. Unfortunately, Raoul Wallenberg was not that lucky. He was determined to get food because food was running out in the protected houses. So he took some of his money and made an appointment to meet with General Malinovsky of the Russian army. The Russians couldn't imagine that anyone would put his life on the line for a bunch of Jews. And so they felt that he must be doing this to cover up espionage in favor of the Allies, perhaps even in favor of the Germans. At any rate, they didn't believe him, and he has not been seen a free man since, and obviously by now there's no chance that he's alive. So that is the short version. I gave you the short version because I understand you have a time limitation. For 37 years, I never spoke about it. And then one day, I got a phone call from someone who said, Rider University is having a big celebration to honor the life of a Swedish hero because he had become an honorary United States citizen. We, all of us children that he saved, called ourselves Wallenberg's children. Well, one of Wallenberg's children became a United States congressman. His name was Thomas Lantos. He introduced the bill in Congress. It was signed by President Reagan, and we were hoping that by making him an honorary citizen, the United States might put pressure on the Russians to release him, to produce him. Well, that was not right. But anyway, when the question was put to me, would I work on a committee, and did I know who this man was, I laughed. And I said, if I didn't know who he was, you wouldn't be talking to me today. And the cat was out of the bag. So 6 weeks after this, I spoke to an audience of 800 in the theater of Rider University. And essentially, I haven't shut up since. Because as difficult as it was, I realize, and I still realize, as old as I am, that I owe a loving, dutiful, how should I say it? What I need to do, and what all of us survivors who have decided to speak, we are aware of how lucky, how fortunate we were. And I realized that, as painful as it is, I needed to speak for the 1.5 million children who didn't have the privilege of growing up as I did, and didn't have a career and a family. And I also owed it to my beloved family who perished in Auschwitz. And above all, I thought I owed it to the young people that I could speak to and perhaps make sure that they become upstanders rather than bystanders. I usually leave students on all levels from 5th grade through university with the same message. One is, we are all human beings first. If you remember that fact, then all of the differences that we have, there are differences between us, become insignificant. Or putting it another way, get to know people who are different from you as individuals. Because if you only know them as the other, you tend to become suspicious. After all, they wear different kind of clothes, they speak a different language, they have different customs, they eat different food, they are just so very different. Suspicion breeds fear. Fear breeds hate. And hate is a slippery slope. At this point, I can only add that I've been at it since 1983, when I came out to speak at Ryder on October 5th, 1983. If the world had learned anything from the Holocaust, I wouldn't be doing this anymore, because it's not cathartic. It doesn't become easier with time. But what we know is that while the perpetrators are different and the victims are different, ethnic cleansing and man's brutality to man is unchanged. And that is definitely the main reason and the worthiest of reasons to keep on going for as long as we can stand up and think relatively logically. So that is where I stand now, and I still work as a liaison officer with the State Department of Education to several colleges and arrange programs and go into classes. And there are some wonderful, wonderful questions that young people ask me. I will never forget this one. Shortly after I began speaking, and I was still very uneasy, because it's very difficult to make this topic age appropriate. And I was talking to a 7th grade class. And during the Q&A, one hand went up, and a young man, still more child than young man, said to me, "Do you think it could happen here?" And I was just totally floored. So I said to him, "I'm going to be a coward and I'll throw it back at you. What do you think?" And he said, "My heart says no, but my head says yes." And so we know that, I'm sure any day you can put on the TV, open your newspaper, and you can find out some new atrocity that has been perpetrated by some people on others. And I think that if you recall the two caveats, the two warnings, and that is getting to know people as individuals and remembering that all of us are human beings, then you will see a much better world, a world that's worth living in.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful, magnificent, miraculous story. And I'm so glad that you decided to share it. And I really think that's going to help out if we all remember what you told us.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much for coming. It was a pleasure. It was fascinating. And once again, thank you for sharing your
Well, I'm
story.
proud of young people like you who take the time to do this.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to us. Well, I hope that our viewers enjoyed the interview. And thanks for coming.
Thank you.
My pleasure.